Today we're going to discuss Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street. And Leon, this is a very different kind of fiction than what we're accustomed to think of Herman Melville producing. We tend to think of Moby-Dick and Billy Budd, these great seafaring tales, and yet the setting for this is something very different from the ocean. Tell us a little bit about the basic structure of the story.
This is a very different story. This is set in New York City on Wall Street, and while the meaning of the story, as I suspect we'll discover, is very complicated, the basic plot is rather simple. A middling Wall Street lawyer, who is also the narrator of the story, needing more assistance, hires a new scrivener. Scrivener is a copyist to join his firm. Enter Bartleby. Although initially very productive in his copying, he calmly refuses when asked to help with proofreading or other rather ordinary office tasks. "I would prefer not to," is his reply, and this one is repeated more than 20 times in the story. The lawyer and his other employees are absolutely shocked, but Bartleby holds fast. He prefers not to. Both touched and disconcerted, yet choosing not to fire him, the lawyer is strangely drawn into coping with Bartleby and his growing refusals and eccentricities, and the theme of the rest of the story is the lawyer's attempt to deal with Bartleby. Bartleby, we learn, is always in the office, either incessantly working or staring out of the window at a facing wall. On a chance Sunday visit to the office, the lawyer discovers that Bartleby also lives there. Eventually, Bartleby's refusals extend also to his work as a copyist. He prefers not to do any work, yet he prefers not to quit the office. The lawyer, waffling between pity and indignation, finally asks him, bribes him to leave, and commands him to leave the office. But Bartleby prefers not to. So instead, the lawyer moves his office, leaving Bartleby behind. Another lawyer moves into the building and quickly learns that Bartleby comes with the territory. He complains to the narrator, who disclaims any responsibility for him. The new proprietor has Bartleby arrested for vagrancy, and he's imprisoned in the tombs, the halls of justice. There, too, he prefers not to, including not to eat. The narrator visits Bartleby, but he can't get through to him. On his next visit, the narrator finds Bartleby lying dead of starvation, huddling against the wall in the prison yard. At the very end, in a brief coda, the narrator informs us of a late arriving rumor to the effect that Bartleby had previously worked as a clerk in an obscure branch of the post office known as the Dead Letter Office, sorting through undeliverable mail that would have brought hoped-for news and gifts to people who died with their hopes unfulfilled.
This is a very gloomy story that's not full of a lot of happy, redemptive, easy thoughts.
It is a gloomy and dark story, but it is also, and one of the things Leon left out is the very beginning, it's also a comical story. And you get this from the very beginning with his characterization of the lawyer's staff. Turkey and Ginger Nut.
Yes. Even the names.
Even the names. So there's that comedy, that's a kind of comic relief, or you could even say a kind of foil for Bartleby, yes. Those two characters, but also in the writing, in the rest of the story. There's a kind of irony which every time you're taken in by what seems to be dark and gloomy thoughts of the lawyer, you also tend to laugh because of the way in which he expresses himself.
Melville does devote a lot of time to the office and to setting the scene before Bartleby enters onto the scene. So let's talk about that. Let's talk not just about this comical, almost Dickensian other Scriveners, but the lawyer himself.
Yeah, and that the narrator himself begins with himself. He says, I'm going to tell this story of Bartleby the Scrivener, but to really understand Bartleby, you're going to have to understand me and my employees and my business. And he presents himself with really a great deal of frankness. He says, I am an eminently safe man. He makes clear that he's not really ambitious. And that this is the source of his very remunerative law business. He says he prides himself on his prudence and his method. But this is clearly not the prudence of which the ancients spoke. It's not practical wisdom. It's extremely narrow kind of prudence. He's very cautious. He's very conventional. He doesn't take any strong or decisive action. So even though he's the boss of this place, he's extremely accommodating towards his employees. Regarding them simply as instruments, flawed instruments, but he's going to find his way to kind of work around them. And
that goes to the usefulness. What is useful is eminently important to him. And when he says he's an eminently safe man, that really means he won't take any risks. And you see that by his keeping these people who are ineffective half of the day, each one of them, employed. But also, I think the reference to the Master of Chancery, that he has just received that, which is the occasion for his hiring Bartleby, as Leon described. That, and in the same sentence, he says it lasted too short a time. And as you put it, he was really interested in the money. But I think the point is, he also sees himself as a victim. A victim of progress.
In some ways, he's not that efficient. He keeps on employees who are not entirely reliable.
Isn't it important to know what kind of business his law practices?
Yes. Well, can we talk a little more about that?
Right, he says rich men's mortgages
Yes.
and title deeds. He's a kind of conveyancer
He's a kind of
of these
backstairs
deeds.
operator for the
Yeah.
wealthy. Yeah.
But he calls it a snug business.
Yeah.
So that even that is comfortable. There's no risk to be taken there.
And indeed, what finally makes him decide he has to do something about Bartleby is the fact that he's being gossiped about by other people in the legal trade, and it's going to be bad for business.
Yeah, and he puts up with these characters in the office. Turkey, who's an alcoholic and gets violent in the afternoon, and Nippers, who's a younger man, ambitious and dyspeptic, who's violent in the morning, and Ginger Nut, who's a 12-year-old kid whose father sent him so that he wouldn't be a carman, but instead would have a seat on the bench. He puts up with these people who, at best, do a half a day's work and are a cause of difficulty, partly because he doesn't like confrontation, and he'll work around their deficiencies. And after all, when they do work, they do pretty good work. And it's just the path of least resistance. And as Amy says, the safest course. I mean, he's an accommodationist.
So we have a kind of picture of the office, and in all of its sort of vivid peculiarity. And then this motionless.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes.
Since you've talked the picture of the office, we've talked about the personnel, but it's worth a couple sentences about the office.
Yes.
The office is walled in. It is a walled-in room, basically, with a partition, folding doors in between. And it has windows on one side that point to a white wall, and on the other side that point to a red wall that has turned black.
Yes.
And it's on the second floor, surrounded by huge structures, so that one imagines that it's quite dim and probably dingy, and there's no carpeting on the floor, so it's rather bleak.
So we have the entrance of the motionless young man, Bartleby. I think it's tempting to get drawn in to a long and ultimately, I think, fruitless speculation about just what is going on with Bartleby, what happened to him, what is he working through, how do we diagnose him? And I don't want to try to suppress that because there's a certain amount of it you have to do. But let's try for a while to talk about how the others respond to him.
Prior to their response, just how he's described. And the description that we get of him is mostly through the eyes of the lawyer. And so what do we see before us when we see a Bartleby?
Yeah.
So he's young, he's pallidly neat, he's pitiably respectable, he's writes silently, palely. He's often said to be looking out at this dead wall. His window in his little cubicle looks out only 3 feet away into the dead red wall, and often he's said to be in a dead wall reverie. You want to add some things about Bartleby?
At the first appearance, he's motionless. When an ad is placed and he arrives at an open door, he just appears out of nowhere, motionless at the door, and Amy's described part of it, but also incurably forlorn. That's his look. I mean, he looks like a lost sheep. Pale, respectable but pale. He appeals to the lawyer in part because, unlike the other guys in the office, he's not going to make any trouble. I mean, in fact, he has this fantasy that he's going to bring Bartleby into the office, and maybe Bartleby's calmness and placidity will spread to the obstreperous other two.
He's described several times. He's compared to a ghost. Several times he's compared to an apparition. He's said to look cadaverous at least 3 times. His place is referred to as a hermitage, his little cubicle. So he is really isolated from the rest. Right.
You might say that it's his aspiration to become like the walls that he looks at. At one point, he's just when the lawyer finally moves his office to another location and Bartleby is left behind, he's described as standing like a column of a ruined. A pillar of a ruined temple.
And in fact, it's this allegedly inhuman quality of his, not the stone-like character, but his absence of any real affect, his absence of any anger, spirit, evidence of loves, evidence of hates, that both infuriate and also, in a way, interest the lawyer. He says at a certain point, if he'd only shown any human qualities, I would have fired him on the spot. Now, I doubt that the lawyer would have. I mean, because the lawyer strikes me as a person who's not going to fire anybody. But it's clear that this man will talk about his preferences, but it's with this absolutely flat voice and flat affect. And it doesn't look like he's countermanding your will. It doesn't look like he's responding to you at all in any kind of way.
What is it about him, and really this is a question more about the lawyer than about him. I think Bartleby in some ways it's like a mirror who reflects back on those of us who contemplate him. But it's said several times that he is, the lawyer is disarmed by him. And when he does one of these outrageous, I would prefer not to, he thinks to respond and he says, but there's something in him just disarmed me. What is it? Is it the forlornness? Is it, at one point he talks about feeling a kind of commonality with him as sons of Adam.
Yeah, I don't know that it's so much a response to the forlornness. There are times where he does respond to that in this very human way. He's touched by that. But the being disarmed, I think, is more the willfulness of Bartleby, because there is something very willful about it in these refusals. So the lawyer says that he himself operates on assumptions, and those assumptions are usually wrong, and then he engages in all of these kind of rationalizations. He uses his prudence and his reason to come up with, explanations for why he's behaving the way he's behaving. But Bartleby acts he comes to realize this. He says Bartleby just acts on the basis of preferences. Right? And the preference is always a negative preference. It's never a preference to do something. It's a preference that I would prefer not to. And so it is that rejectionist attitude that he comes up against, and he doesn't. The lawyer himself is very passive, and so he says Bartleby came to assume a kind of ascendancy over me. It's Bartleby who was in a way ruling through his rejection.
Diana, isn't there a difference between saying I prefer not to and I will not?
Well, the lawyer at one point says, "You mean you will not?" And Bartleby just reiterates, "No, I prefer not." But I'm not sure that the lawyer isn't right about that. That there is something willed about the choices that Bartleby is making.
See, I think it's precisely because he's not willful that he unmans or disarms the lawyer, that he says very quietly, steadily, calmly, I prefer not to. There's nothing human in that. There's nothing you could really respond to.
Right. I mean, and that's what I meant by saying that he tries to become a stone, but it does seem to me it is something he is aiming at or choosing. That he...
Look, could I try to walk between the two of you? I think I'm inclined to agree with Amy that there's something will-less about Bartleby. And the general formulation, I would prefer not to, and then you can fill in the rest of the infinitive as you please. Whatever the verb is, I prefer not to act, which means whatever his preferences are, they don't translate into that principle of action, which is an act of will. I think the lawyer experiences these expressions of preferences as if they were willful acts, as if they were, as you say, a denial of the world of assumptions, which is, after all, the rational world in which people have reasons to do the things that you would expect them to do out of interests which lead them to assert themselves in the world. And here you have this passive fellow who every time an action is called for, he won't act, and he won't even put it in the form of, I won't do it, I defy you. It is operationally a form of defiance. It's experienced periodically with irritation and annoyance. But that's not the whole thing, because the other side of it is that he's in a way touched by Bartleby. He's touched by the existence of a creature who seems, either less than human or maybe superhuman in his not asserting himself, in his merely stating his preferences and then being somehow there for you to make something of him. So that in one of the places he said, I was disarmed, and I've forgotten exactly, but it's, I was both touched and disconcerted. Touched seems to be a kind of expression of motion toward and sympathy. On the other hand, he doesn't know what to make of him.
I just want to emphasize one thing that you said. The lawyer is a man of assumptions. He sees the world, you make certain assumptions and people act rationally, and the world is a logical place. It's ordered and logical. Bartleby is not. Bartleby is a man of preferences and negative preferences, which presents itself as a kind of absolute freedom, but makes absolutely no sense. So the two of them, though spiritually this far apart, are really bound in some way. The lawyer doesn't know what to make of him.
So Bartleby rejects reason. It seems to me he absolutely rejects reason, and the alternative to that is preference. And I guess I still don't quite see why that isn't will. And it seems to me in rejecting reason, that's why he has to reject this entire world of letters and the world. Why he doesn't read, why he won't write. why he won't have anything to do with the post office. And the lawyer is absolutely wedded to the world of letters. He actually, when he tries to get rid of Bartleby, he says, you know, why don't you go off and then write me a letter if there's anything that you need from me, and I'll come to your aid. Or he says, if I could only find out, you know, whether he had family, and then I could write a letter to them. So he really believes in the efficacy of letters, which is to say, of reason, even though his understanding of reason is a rather narrowed one.
The lawyer is simply looking for reasons why Bartleby is the way he is. He does not try to probe the character of Bartleby's wishes.
The way the lawyer treats him from the beginning would not cause Bartleby to open up in any way. I mean, the first time that Bartleby refuses is when the lawyer is busy with something, he's looking down, he's looking at one document, and he hands the document out to Bartleby and then summons him and does not look up from what he's doing, sort of, you know, just treating him in this purely instrumental way. And I believe that's the first occasion on which Bartleby says, I'd prefer not.
And the story is Bartleby the Scrivener, not anything else. We never really know anything else about his background, his origins, where he came from, let alone what the source of this malady in him is.
I want to say something about that subtitle, the Scrivener. Actually, it's in the main title, Bartleby the Scrivener. I think that we really should remind ourselves of what a scrivener is, or a scribe. A scrivener is a public copyist, an official writer, but it is a role that had a much higher status in the past. So if you go back to ancient Israel or all the way up through New Testament times, the scribes were those who studied Scripture. They served as copyists and editors and teachers and jurists, so that the letters that they dealt with were living letters, the living letters of the Word of God. Right? There are a number of biblical references in this story. John 1:1 is not mentioned, but another verse from John is mentioned. But if we think about John 1:1, the Word is identified with God himself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But Bartleby now lives in a world where letters serve a very different and a much attenuated function, and where scribes and scriveners have a much reduced function. So if I could just tie this into the end of the story, at the very end, the lawyer passes along this rumor that he had heard about Bartleby having maybe worked in the dead letter office. The lawyer, who very much believes in the efficacy of letters, speculates that this experience of letters gone awry, right, would have perhaps contributed to Bartleby's affliction. On errands of life, these letters speed to death. But it seems to me that what the lawyer doesn't really understand is that for Bartleby, the letters that he deals with in the law office are just as much dead letters as those that he dealt with at the dead letter office of the post office. And it's that dawning realization of Bartleby's that I think is the origin of his progressive refusals. And there is a progress in those refusals, those withdrawals from life. So Bartleby has really given up on the word. He's given up on communication, and that's why he lapses into silence, speaks only to refuse engagement, and stares at these blank walls instead. But it does seem to me that Melville might be suggesting, the lawyer is not, but Melville might be suggesting that there really is a kernel of truth in Bartleby's intuitions about the status of letters and the status of the word in modern life.
I'm very moved by what you say, thinking back to the origins of the scribe and how great the fall. I think that is clearly one of the meanings here, that these guys are human Xerox machines.
I think that's exactly the point. That it is the lawyer that calls him the Scrivener. But he is the quintessential Scrivener. He's a copyist. He does what a machine will later do. And so Diana's description of the difference between the ancient and the modern with respect to being a scribe is very, very important and poignant. The modern scribe, he, as a modern scribe, does nothing but copy what other people have done. Yes. He is not doing anything that's important. He is working with dead letters, even when he is actually working.
I like what's been said here about the changing meaning of the writing, the diminished character of work, which has now been replaced. It was first replaced by carbon paper, and is now replaced by Xerox machines and the like. But there's also a human element in the story which is central from the beginning. He has to describe his employees, and they are to him employees. The word employee literally means a tool, that which is used. And when he sets Bartleby up, as someone has already said, in his office, he puts him behind a screen so that he doesn't have to see him, but he will be there to command. Even before he reaches out the paper
Right, he's already walled him off.
without looking at him, he's put him in a place where he won't have to look at him. He talks about how he has society and privacy together, right? But the view of society is, I am present with my tools. Yes, they have their human qualities, but I can ignore them providing they do their work. And the emergence of Bartleby compels him to see that there is more to this man than his utility, because he refuses to be useful in the ordinary way. And what he's then left with is Bartleby, not the Scrivener, but Bartleby the human being. And I think it would be worth talking about what we make of how well the lawyer, he does somehow recognize that there's something left over that he has to deal with. The question is, does he do a good job of it?
Well, to begin with, I would say he doesn't act. He's acted upon. Bartleby has a wondrous ascendancy over him. So his actions are all responsive. They're reactive. He is not a man. That's what it means to be disarmed. He was literally disarmed by this man.
And unmanned.
And unmanned.
Yeah.
Unmanned. And he waffles always between pity and between repulsion.
Well, what didn't he do that he should have done?
Each time I read this story, I move, I'm moved very far from I was at the beginning. When I first read the story and Bartleby refuses to proofread the copies that he himself has written, that was it. He was out of there. The conditions of our relationship, our employment, I'm not your social worker or your father confessor or your friend. You've come here to do a job. We have, by everybody's mutual understanding, a relationship of utility. That's all there is here. When we cease to be useful to one to the other, that's it. And I think the story is meant to be an education of people like me. Whether the lawyer is finely educated or not, Melville arranges it for the lawyer to speak out of his own mouth, so that I think he condemns himself without knowing it almost at every step of the way. He doesn't fire him, so he recognizes that there's something here that's curious, that's touching, that's pitiable, that we're, after all, both sons of Adam. Oh my God, he's forlorn, he's afflicted in soul. When he discovers that he's living in the office, what lonesomeness. He even gets it into his head that after studying Jonathan Edwards on the will and Priestley on necessity, that maybe Providence has sent Bartleby to me, and my mission is to give him an office, not to tend to his wounded soul, not to sit with him there on the banister when he finds him there. In the end, he offers to take him home only so long as we would find some other place to send you. And I think he gets a 0 in terms of understanding the humanity of another human being.
Can I make you be more concrete? What would be the right response?
If you're not going to fire him, in other words, if you're really going to enter into some kind of relation, you should try to find out who this is, not in the realm of asking for reasons and explanations, but by paying attention, by keeping company, by providing a meal and sharing a meal.
Yeah.
By
but-
offering to take him home, which is the last thing he offers to do, when he gives him a litany of choices, the last thing he says is, "Oh, well, Bartleby, I've decided maybe you should come home with me." I don't have as strong a view as you. I don't dislike the lawyer, and I'm not sure whether the lawyer learned something or whether he doesn't learn something. But on the assumption that he doesn't learn something, it's because the lawyer seems to be incapable of treating him as a human being. And the thing that disarms the lawyer is that the lawyer is aware, or made aware by Bartleby, that the lawyer himself is really not a human being.
That's very nice. There's one moment, and then you should come back at me, but the one moment where Bartleby has refused to do something or has preferred not to do something, and the lawyer tries again, and what is the reason for that? And he says, you can see for yourself the reason. And the lawyer looks at him and he says, "Oh, your eyesight has gone bad because you've been scribbling here in the dark."
Yeah.
He's in a way medicalized him. Bartleby is in effect saying, "Don't you see?" And then, of course, we can all fill in what we think would be seen if you saw Bartleby as the broken, dispirited, hopeless human being that he is. And the lawyer is looking for some kind of problem that he can fix.
So what you are really suggesting is that what the lawyer could do for Bartleby is what would mean treating him on a human level. He could give him some hope, he could give him some encouragement.
He could give him some company, some human company.
But, okay, company. But remember, Bartleby stands in dead wall reveries, hour after hour after hour after hour. And so if what you're calling for is to join him, right? So, you can't engage him in conversation because he rejects conversation. So you're going to stand with him and look at the wall. Now, it's possible that Bartleby might recognize that as some kind of reaching out to him and respond to it, and so it's maybe worth an effort. But in other words, I think you're really underestimating, in a way, the threat that Bartleby proposes. I mean, he represents death within us, and
But what Leon's saying may be, I know I'm the one that asked the question, what should he have done? But maybe the most important thing to take away from the story is a certain attitude, a certain movement of the heart, of the soul.
I agree about the inadequacies of the lawyer, but I don't think we should underestimate the obstacles to care in this case. I mean, this is not like someone in a persistently vegetative state. I mean, that is easy compared to this,
Correct.
right? You care for the body, you recognize the dignity that was the person, all of that. But this is
But
this
look,
is much more intransigent and really, I think, more threatening, really, to human life and human society.
I think you're right if you simply concentrate on the dead wall reveries. But you yourself made the point that there is some kind of gradual transformation of this man. And the gradual transformation of Bartleby is accompanied by the responses of the lawyer. And so to begin with, when the lawyer is said, he is shocked or he's stunned, like a pillar of salt. He was made, or he's turned into a pillar of salt. If we take that reference seriously, well, that's obviously a reference to the Bible, and the person who is turned into a pillar of salt is Lot's wife, who looks at the destruction, the fiery destruction of the city that she was a part of. What does that mean for him? When he confronts Bartleby, or Bartleby says, "I prefer not to," he's turned into a pillar of salt, and he's made to see something about Bartleby has rained destruction on his life. So that the narrator, the lawyer, is brought into some kind of self-awareness. At that point, it seems to me that there is another option besides what he will do, which drives Bartleby more and more and more into the tomb. He makes his office a tomb, and then he rightfully goes to what's called the tombs, which are really the Hall of Justice.
Let's go back for a minute to Wall Street, that this is a story of Wall Street. And we made the point earlier that there literally are repeated images of walls encasing the office, of the walls that Bartleby favors as points of contemplation. Is there, of course, when we think of Wall Street, and in Melville's own time, this would have already been the case, we think of the financial district of New York, of the New York Stock Exchange, of the hub of American capitalism and a lot of American banking. And is that relevant here or not?
It really is emblematic of the failure to communicate. Mm-hmm. People don't speak to each other. They have no relation one to the other. And so that they are literally walled off from each other.
Mm-hmm. But also that this is linked to the commercial character of the regime.
Sure.
It might be worth mentioning that Melville himself followed a course that was somewhat reminiscent of Bartleby's. His early novels, the sea stories and sea adventures, they were immensely popular. But his later works, neither Moby-Dick nor Pierre was well received. Melville really became something of a pariah in the literary world. He turned to poetry, he encountered similar neglect, and in the last quarter century of his life, he wrote little and he published less. Friends feared for his sanity. His wife's family tried to get her to leave him and to have him committed as insane. He wound up working for 19 years as a customs inspector in New York. So he died in his 70s. He was completely forgotten. He did not know that he would come to be regarded as the author of perhaps America's greatest novel. So I think it would be possible to read Bartleby as a profoundly disheartening allegory of the artist's relation to a commercial democratic society.
You were again emphasizing two different forms of reason, language, and speech, the artist being a certain high-minded one, and presumably the scrivener who copies other people's financial arrangements being rather low. But Amy is emphasizing the other aspect of speech, which is communication and community.
Aren't those the same? I mean, man is the reasonable animal and therefore the political animal.
It's one thing to say the world may have lost the great novelist. It's another thing to say that the rationalization of the world for the sake of usefulness puts a wall between each man and his neighbor, whether they write great novels or not. And it seems to me that this is a world in which, look, the modern world really does depend upon method, upon a certain understanding of prudence, not in the ancient sense, a certain kind of practicality, a certain kind of utility, no nonsense, and assumptions that causes have effects and people have reasons and we can understand them. And don't bother us with the deep questions of the soul or with the ultimate questions about the hereafter or those sorts of things. And Melville shows us a kind of world in which that kind of emphasis on that kind of rationalization, that kind of instrumentality, produces a world in which everybody is alone. None of these, it's not just Bartleby who has no family. The lawyer, we assume, has nobody at home. Nippers and Turkey have nobody at home. And Ginger Nut has a father who wants him to,
go away from home.
This is a world of isolated human beings. And the question he's raising for us is, in a way, the greatness of American finance and industry and capitalism bought at the cost of a certain kind of erosion of the fundamental relations of human beings one to the other. You don't have to be a Marxist to at least raise this question about the alienation of human beings under conditions of modern life. And it might be the very backside of what's wonderful about it.
That actually brings me to a question I definitely want to ask, is why you included this reading in this selection, this gloomy reading, which is, you could read as very critical of America rather than celebratory. How did you think of it in terms of the mosaic of the whole?
Well, I think this is the inclusion of the story is an indication that this is not just cheerleading for America, but really exploring the fundamental character of Americans, including perhaps the downside of that character. And it is America's poets, above all, who really draw our attention to that. So Melville is a poet who is trying to find some way to address this commercial society, and maybe that's one reason why he has a commercial man himself narrate it.
There's an aspect of American individualism, American commercialism, that can lead us down this very dark and dangerous path. We did nothing with the Christianity in the story, which is very prominent and very important, but it's a false Christianity. It's a false Christianity that the lawyer has. And what Melville might be pointing to is that you need some kind of religion to nurture this other, more spiritual aspect of human beings.
It is interesting that after, on that Sunday when he comes to his office, he's going to Trinity Church, the famous church in Wall Street, and gets there a little early, so he goes by his chambers and discovers that Bartleby is there, and he's so disturbed that he says, I couldn't go to church after that. And it's interesting, could he not go to church because he felt somehow unworthy to do so? I don't think so. I think it's because of the feeling that what he would get there is somehow incommensurate with the reality of what he's seen, of the desperation and dark insight into the human prospect, humanity.
But it also has to do with the fact that he has no understanding of what church is really for. Mm-hmm. He's going to church to hear some sermon by a famous man. That's what leads him there. We have no reason.
That's right.
We have no reason to believe that he's a regular churchgoer. And so he's not fit to go there because he suddenly has a window into the human soul.
Americans, as a practical-minded people focused on here and now and on the bottom line, tend, if at all, only on Sundays to think about the ultimate matters, about the first things, about the last things, about the soul and its fate. And we are in danger of being forgetful about those ultimate things. Melville was always interested in those things. I mean, Moby-Dick is about nothing so much as about those kinds of ultimate questions. And here there's a story which, by its absence, save in the presence of Bartleby, who is nakedly and alone confronting that large and mysterious thing, and maybe embracing it out of sickness or despair, but nevertheless, Bartleby at least goes to his death somehow knowingly. And that aspect of what is the lot of all the sons of Adam tends to be forgotten, most of the time for good. It's best not to see that staring you in the face all the time. But to be forgetful of it is, in fact, to lapse into a kind of thoughtless living and to be in danger of a certain inhumanity. And I think Melville has that on his mind in this story. At least I certainly got that from it. The more I read it, the more I see things that I never would have occurred to me when I was like the lawyer in the opening scene.
And it's something also that part of me wants to say that the lawyer comes to see. When he finds Bartleby is dead, he says he's resting with kings and counselors. And that's from a very dark passage of Job, which asks, why was I ever born? So there's intimations that the lawyer has understood something by then that he just failed to get.
because counselors includes him too, right?
Because a counselor is a pun on counselor.
Lawyers.
Yeah, lawyer.
It's very nice.
Thank you, Amy and Diana and Leon for this very stimulating discussion, which I think in its liveliness and disagreements shows why these stories and speeches and songs continue to have life and are not easily exhausted so far as their meaning is concerned. Thank you all.